They say you can hear a gunshot from a mile away and a leopard's growl from half that distance, but the silent scream of a broken soldier echoes through eternity with no one listening. Those weathered hands were never meant to touch wild fur with such tenderness, and those amber eyes were never meant to look at a human without fear. In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where trust is a luxury that costs lives and survival depends on killing before being killed, the most impossible friendship in military history was about to rewrite everything we thought we knew about the bond between predator and protector. The Hindu Kush Mountains stretched endlessly under a blood-red sunset, their jagged peaks cutting through the sky like broken promises. Master Sergeant Jake Morrison crouched behind a cluster of rocks, his rifle steady in hands that had held weapons longer than they had held anything gentle. At 34, Jake's face bore the map of too many deployments, too many firefights, too many friends who never made it home. His unit had been tracking Taliban insurgents through these treacherous mountain passes for 6 days, living on MREs and adrenaline, sleeping in 2-hour shifts while death whispered through the wind. But Jake carried wounds deeper than any battlefield could inflict. 3 months earlier, an IED had torn through his convoy outside Kandahar. The explosion hadn't just shattered metal and concrete. It had vaporized his closest friend, Corporal Danny Martinez, who had been riding in the seat Jake was supposed to occupy. Danny had volunteered to take Jake's place that morning because Jake was running a fever. The guilt ate at Jake's soul like acid, leaving him hollow, questioning every breath he took that Danny couldn't. The military psychologist had used words like survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress, but Jake knew the truth was simpler and more brutal. He was alive when he should be dead, breathing when his brother was buried beneath 6 feet of American soil. Sleep brought nightmares of Danny's final radio transmission, cut short by the roar of explosives. Food tasted like ash. Colors seemed drained from the world, leaving only shades of gray and the persistent red of blood that Jake saw behind his closed eyelids. Miles away from Jake's position, in a cave system carved into the mountainside by centuries of wind and rain, another survivor was fighting her own battle against loss and betrayal. Zara, a 5-year-old female snow leopard, paced restlessly on the narrow ledge outside her den. Her thick, smoky gray coat with its distinctive black rosettes rippled over muscles designed for navigating impossible terrain, but her usual grace was marred by a pronounced limp in her left hind leg. 2 weeks ago, Zara had been tracking blue sheep across the high ridges when the sound of helicopters had filled the valley below. Military operations meant chaos, and chaos meant danger for every living creature in these mountains. As she had retreated to higher ground, a stray rocket had exploded against the cliff face above her, sending tons of rock cascading down the mountainside. Zara had barely escaped with her life, but falling debris had crushed her left leg and, far worse, had sealed the entrance to the den where her 2 cubs waited for her return. For days, Zara had clawed at the rocks until her paws bled, her desperate calls echoing off the stone walls. But the cubs, barely 3 months old and unable to survive without their mother's milk and protection, had been buried too deep, the rockfall too massive for any single creature to move. The silence that eventually replaced their answering mules was more deafening than any explosion. Now, both survivors wandered their respective territories like ghosts haunting the scenes of their greatest failures. Jake's unit had established a temporary observation post on a rocky outcrop that offered commanding views of 3 valley approaches used by insurgent forces. The mission was supposed to last 48 hours, but intelligence reports of increased enemy movement had extended their stay to nearly a week. Jake welcomed the isolation. The further he was from base camp, the fewer people who might see the cracks spreading through his carefully maintained soldier's facade. His squad leader, Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, had noticed Jake's deteriorating condition. She'd seen too many good soldiers lose themselves to the weight of survival, watched strong men crumble under the pressure of staying alive while their brothers fell. During their brief radio checks, she'd tried to engage Jake in conversation beyond tactical reports, but he responded only with clipped, professional acknowledgments. The Jake Morrison, who used to tell stories about his childhood in Montana, who could make the whole squad laugh during the darkest moments, had disappeared somewhere between Kandahar and these cursed mountains. The observation post offered Jake something he desperately needed: solitude. While his teammates maintained watch schedules and equipment checks, Jake often found himself staring into the vast emptiness of the Afghan wilderness, searching for something he couldn't name. The mountains held a strange beauty that reminded him why he joined the army in the first place. Not for politics or patriotism, though those mattered, but for the simple human need to protect something larger than himself. Now, he felt too broken to protect anyone. Zara's grief manifested differently, but with equal intensity. Snow leopards are naturally solitary creatures, but the loss of her cubs had left her with an emptiness that went beyond loneliness. Her body still produced milk, a biological reminder of the children who would never nurse again. The hunting that had once been instinctive now felt purposeless. Why kill to eat when eating meant continuing a life that felt devoid of meaning? She had lost weight, her magnificent coat growing dull and lifeless. The injury to her leg complicated everything. What should have been a minor inconvenience for a creature of her agility had become a constant reminder of that terrible day. She could still hunt small prey and navigate most terrain, but the explosive power and precision that had made her one of the mountain's apex predators was diminished. Worse, the limp made her vulnerable to the other dangers that stalked these peaks: wolves, wild dogs, and the two-legged predators who carried fire sticks and brought death from the sky. On the 7th night of their extended mission, a fierce snowstorm swept through the Hindu Kush, bringing winds that howled like the voices of the dead and temperatures that dropped well below freezing. Jake's team had taken shelter in a shallow cave system they discovered during their initial reconnaissance, but the natural windbreak provided only minimal protection from the elements. As the storm intensified, it became clear that this was no ordinary weather event. This was the kind of blizzard that killed even experienced mountain dwellers. Jake volunteered for the midnight watch, partly for military discipline but mostly because sleep had become his enemy. The storm's fury matched the chaos in his mind, and he found a strange comfort in the mountain's raw, destructive power. As he peered through his night vision scope, scanning the white-swept landscape for any sign of enemy movement, he had no idea that the storm was driving another desperate soul directly toward his position. Zara pressed herself against the cliff face as the blizzard raged around her, her thick fur offering some protection against the brutal cold, but not enough. The storm had caught her far from any suitable shelter while she was attempting to hunt a wounded marmot, a desperate pursuit for an animal that would normally never waste energy on such meager prey. Her injured leg throbbed with each step, the old wound aggravated by the freezing temperatures and treacherous footing. The wind carried scents that confused and alarmed her, the metallic smell of human weapons, the synthetic odors of modern equipment, and something else, the distinct musk of men under stress. Her instincts screamed danger, but the storm was becoming deadly even for a creature designed to survive in these harsh conditions. Ice was forming in her whiskers, and the snow was accumulating so rapidly that even her broad paws were struggling to find purchase on the increasingly unstable slopes. As she picked her way carefully along a narrow ledge, following what she hoped was a path to lower, more sheltered ground, her damaged leg finally betrayed her. A section of snow-covered rock crumbled under her weight, and Zara found herself sliding down a steep embankment, her claws scraping frantically against stone and ice but finding no grip. She tumbled through darkness, bouncing off unseen obstacles, until she crashed into something that wasn't rock or snow. Jake heard the impact before he saw anything, a heavy thud followed by the distinctive sound of a large animal struggling in the snow just outside the cave entrance. His training kicked in immediately, rifle raised, finger on the trigger, expecting to see a Taliban fighter who had somehow managed to navigate the storm. Through his night vision he detected movement, but what he saw made him freeze in confusion rather than fire. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. A snow leopard, one of the most elusive and magnificent predators in the world, lay partially buried in the snowdrift just 20 feet from their shelter. The animal was clearly injured, favoring one leg and breathing heavily from exhaustion and cold. Blood darkened the snow around her. Whether from old wounds or new ones caused by the fall, Jake couldn't tell. For a moment, neither predator moved, each recognizing the danger the other represented. Every tactical manual Jake had ever studied said the same thing. Wild animals were unpredictable threats that should be eliminated if they posed any risk to the mission or personnel. A wounded leopard was potentially even more dangerous than a healthy one, driven by desperation and pain to attack anything it perceived as a threat. His finger tightened on the trigger as he calculated angles and distances, his military training warring with something else, a recognition of shared suffering that he couldn't quite name. Zara lifted her head with tremendous effort, her golden eyes reflecting the faint light filtering through the cave opening. She had smelled death so often in recent weeks that she almost welcomed it, but what she saw in the human's face wasn't the cold calculation of a hunter. Behind the weapon and the camouflaged uniform, she recognized something familiar. The hollow look of a creature that had lost everything that mattered. The storm continued to rage around them, but for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, soldier and leopard stared at each other across a distance measured not just in feet, but in the vast chasm between species, between predator and prey, between two souls who had been broken by loss. Jake's finger slowly eased off the trigger as he watched the leopard struggle to rise. Something in her movements, the careful way she tested her injured leg, the resigned acceptance in her posture, struck him with unexpected force. This wasn't an aggressive predator preparing to attack. This was a fellow survivor clinging to life in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything beautiful. Against every regulation and instinct drilled into him during 15 years of military service, Jake lowered his weapon. He glanced back at his sleeping teammates, knowing that waking them would mean the leopard's immediate death. Rodriguez would never allow a wild predator this close to their position, injured or not. The mission came first, always, and a snow leopard was a complication they couldn't afford. But as Jake looked back at Zara, he saw something that stopped his rational mind cold. The leopard wasn't trying to flee or preparing to fight. She was simply lying in the snow, her sides heaving with exhaustion, waiting for whatever fate would bring. The resignation in her eyes mirrored exactly what Jake saw in his own reflection every morning. A creature going through the motions of survival without any real hope of healing. Moving with the careful precision that had kept him alive through 4 combat deployments, Jake reached into his pack and pulled out one of his MRE's beef stew, Danny's favorite. His hands shook slightly as he opened the package, the familiar routine bringing a fresh wave of grief. Danny used to joke that military food was so bad it could kill the enemy through biological warfare, but he'd always eaten every bite with genuine appreciation for anything that kept him strong enough to protect his brothers. Jake tore open the thermal heating element and activated it, the chemical reaction warming the meal despite the sub-zero temperatures. The smell of heated beef and vegetables filled the cave entrance, and he saw Zara's nostrils flare as she caught the scent. Hunger was a universal language, and Jake recognized the desperate need in her response. With movements slow enough not to trigger her flight response, Jake placed the warm meal in the snow halfway between himself and the leopard. Then he retreated to the cave mouth, his rifle within reach but pointed away from her, and settled in to wait. The storm continued to howl around them, but inside this small pocket of unexpected understanding, 2 broken souls began to discover that sometimes survival meant taking impossible risks on behalf of someone else's pain. For nearly an hour, Zara stared at the steaming container while Jake remained motionless against the cave wall. The aroma of cooked meat triggered hunger pangs that she had been ignoring for days, but accepting food from a human violated every survival instinct inherited from countless generations of her ancestors. Yet the alternative was slowly freezing to death in a blizzard that showed no signs of abating. Finally, desperation overcame caution. Zara dragged herself forward through the snow, her injured leg leaving a trail of red droplets that froze almost instantly in the bitter cold. She approached the meal with extreme wariness, golden eyes never leaving Jake's position, ready to retreat at the first sign of aggressive movement. When she reached the container, she sniffed it thoroughly before taking her first tentative bite. The warmth of the food spread through her empty stomach like liquid fire, and suddenly she was eating with desperate hunger, her rough tongue cleaning every trace of beef and gravy from the container. Jake watched in fascination as this magnificent predator consumed military rations with the same intensity he'd seen in starving soldiers after days without resupply. When she finished, Zara looked directly at him for the first time, not with the wary calculation of prey assessing a threat, but with something approaching recognition. Over the next 3 hours, as the storm gradually weakened, an extraordinary routine developed between them. Jake would move slowly to check his radio or adjust his equipment, and Zara would track his movements, but without the coiled tension of an animal preparing to flee. When he offered her water from his canteen, pouring it into his metal cup and sliding it across the snow, she drank gratefully, her pink tongue lapping at the liquid that had already begun to form ice crystals around the edges. The most remarkable moment came when Jake's radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice conducting a routine check-in. As Jake responded with his situation report, carefully omitting any mention of his unexpected companion, Zara's ears pricked forward at the sound of human speech. Instead of bolting in terror, she seemed to listen, her head tilted with what appeared to be curiosity rather than fear. When dawn finally broke through the dissipating clouds, revealing a landscape transformed by feet of fresh snow, both Jake and Zara faced the same realization: their time together was ending. Jake's unit would be moving out within hours, and Zara needed to return to the wild territory that was her only chance of survival. But something had changed during their shared vigil against the storm. A connection had formed that neither military training nor animal instinct could fully explain. As Jake's teammates began stirring in the early morning light, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Moving with practiced stealth, he gathered several more MREs from his pack, along with his personal first aid kit. Zara watched his preparations with alert intelligence, somehow understanding that their strange sanctuary was about to be discovered by others who might not share Jake's inexplicable compassion. Jake approached her slowly, speaking in the same low, calm voice he'd once used to soothe frightened civilians during humanitarian missions. "Easy, girl. I know you're hurt." He knelt in the snow just beyond her reach and opened the medical kit, pulling out antiseptic wipes and gauze bandages. Zara's muscles tensed, but she didn't retreat. The infection brewing in her leg wound had begun to weaken her, and some primal part of her recognized that this human's intentions were not hostile. The trust that followed defied every law of nature and military protocol. Jake cleaned the deep gash on Zara's leg while she remained perfectly still, occasionally letting out soft grunts of discomfort but never attempting to bite or claw him. Her amber eyes stayed fixed on his face throughout the process, as if she were reading his intentions in his expression. When he wrapped the wound with military-grade bandages, she actually leaned into his touch, seeking the warmth of human contact. Rodriguez's voice calling his name from deeper in the cave sent a jolt of panic through both of them. Jake quickly pressed the remaining MREs into a natural depression in the rock face, where Zara could reach them, then touched her head gently, a gesture that should have resulted in severe injury, but instead earned him a soft rumble that sounded almost like gratitude. "Go," he whispered urgently. "Get somewhere safe." Zara rose unsteadily, testing her newly bandaged leg. The pain was still there, but the bleeding had stopped, and the supportive wrapping gave her more stability than she'd had in weeks. She looked at Jake one final time, and in that gaze was an intelligence that transcended species barriers, a promise that she would remember this kindness. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. As Rodriguez emerged from the cave, Jake was cleaning his rifle and checking his radio, the picture of a disciplined soldier preparing for movement. The snow around their position had been trampled by boots and equipment, effectively erasing any evidence of Zara's presence. When Rodriguez asked about the opened MRE packages, Jake simply shrugged and mentioned being too cold to sleep, needing extra calories to maintain body heat. 3 months later, Jake's deployment ended with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that characterized military life: medical evaluations, debriefings, equipment turn-in, and a flight home that felt surreal after so many months in the mountains. He returned to Fort Braxton with commendations for his service, but the nightmares followed him across continents and time zones. The encounter with Zara had given him something he hadn't felt since Danny's death, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival, but civilian life felt hollow and disconnected. The Department of Veterans Affairs assigned him to a PTSD treatment program, where well-meaning counselors encouraged him to process his trauma and, quote, reintegrate into society. Jake went through the motions, attending group sessions and individual therapy, but he found himself thinking constantly about the mountains, about amber eyes that had looked at him without judgment, about a moment of perfect understanding between two damaged souls. His apartment felt like a cage compared to the vast openness of Afghanistan, and he struggled to find meaning in mundane concerns like grocery shopping and traffic jams. 6 months after his return, Jake made a decision that surprised even him. Using his accumulated leave and military savings, he booked a flight back to Afghanistan, not as a soldier this time, but as a wildlife photographer working with a conservation organization studying snow leopard populations in the Hindu Kush. The cover story was legitimate. Jake had always been skilled with cameras, and the organization desperately needed someone with his mountain experience and military training to navigate the dangerous terrain safely. His real mission was personal. He needed to know if Zara had survived, if the kindness they had shared had meant something beyond a single night in a storm. The local guides thought he was crazy for wanting to spend weeks in some of the most remote and treacherous territory in the region. But Jake's military credentials and generous payment convinced them to take him where few outsiders had ever ventured. For 3 weeks, Jake hiked through snow-covered passes and slept in tents that reminded him painfully of his deployment, following rumored leopard territories and setting up camera traps in locations where the cats might hunt or travel. He found tracks, scat, and scratch marks on trees, but no direct sightings of the elusive predators. Local shepherds told stories of a leopard with unusual markings that had been seen in the area, but their descriptions were vague and possibly embellished by multiple retellings. On a crystalline morning in early spring, Jake was checking a camera trap he'd positioned near a natural salt lick when he heard something that made his heart stop. The soft chuff of a snow leopard's greeting call, the same sound Zara had made during their night together. He turned slowly, barely daring to breathe, and saw a magnificent female leopard sitting on a rocky outcrop just 50 yards away, watching him with unmistakable recognition. Zara descended from the rocks with fluid grace, her movements no longer hampered by the limp that had nearly killed her months earlier. The military bandages were long gone, but Jake could see the faint scar where her wound had healed cleanly, without the infection that would have claimed her life in the wild. She approached him with none of the caution typical of her species, stopping just arm's length away and looking directly into his eyes with an intensity that made his chest tighten with emotion. Jake knelt slowly in the snow, extending his hand palm up in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. Zara stepped forward and touched her nose to his fingers, the same greeting they had shared in the cave. Her fur was thick and lustrous now, her body weight healthy, and Jake realized with overwhelming relief that she had not just survived. She had thrived. The conservation work he'd used as cover for his journey suddenly felt genuinely important as he understood how rare and precious this moment was. For the next hour, they sat together in the thin mountain air, Jake speaking softly about everything that had happened since their separation while Zara listened with the patient attention of an old friend. He told her about the nightmares that still woke him, about Danny and the guilt that gnawed at him, about how their night together had been the first time since the explosion that he'd felt truly alive. She responded with soft vocalizations and occasional head bumps against his shoulder, offering the kind of wordless comfort that no human therapist had been able to provide. When Jake finally stood to leave, knowing that staying too long might attract unwanted attention from other wildlife or local hunters, Zara rose as well. But instead of retreating to her rocky perch, she began walking alongside him as he made his way down the mountain trail. At first, Jake thought she was simply heading in the same direction, but after an hour of parallel movement, he realized she was deliberately escorting him, protecting him the same way he had protected her during that brutal storm. They traveled together for 3 miles, with Zara maintaining a careful distance that kept them connected while respecting the boundaries between their worlds. She would disappear for minutes at a time, scouting ahead or checking their back trail with the vigilance of a trained soldier, then reappear to confirm that Jake was safe and moving in the right direction. When they reached the valley floor where Jake's guide was waiting with pack animals, Zara stopped at the tree line and watched as he rejoined the human world. Jake turned for one last look at his unlikely guardian, raising his hand in a gesture of farewell and gratitude. Zara stood motionless against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks, her amber eyes holding his until distance and terrain finally broke their visual connection. But Jake carried the certainty that their bond had transcended that night in the storm, becoming something permanent and transformative that would remain with both of them forever. 2 years later, Jake established the Danny Martinez Wildlife Foundation, using his military pension and public speaking fees to fund snow leopard conservation in Afghanistan. He returned to the Hindu Kush twice yearly, ostensibly to monitor camera traps and conduct population surveys, but really to check on Zara. Each visit brought the same miracle. She would appear within hours of his arrival as if some invisible thread connected their souls across impossible distances. On his 7th return trip, Jake discovered something that left him speechless. Zara emerged from the rocks, not alone, but followed by 2 healthy cubs, their thick fur marked with the same distinctive rosettes as their mother. She had not only survived and healed, but had found love and brought new life into the harsh mountain world. The cubs, emboldened by their mother's trust, approached Jake with curious fearlessness, allowing him to photograph them at close range, images that would later help secure international protection for their species. As Jake knelt in the snow watching Zara's cubs play while their mother stood sentinel, he finally understood what Danny would have wanted him to learn. Life wasn't about avoiding death or escaping guilt. It was about creating connections that outlasted individual suffering, about choosing love over fear even when the odds seemed impossible. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they no longer defined him. Instead, he carried the image of amber eyes that had seen his brokenness and chosen compassion over caution. The mountains held their secrets close, but Jake knew that somewhere in those peaks, a leopard family thrived because one soldier had chosen mercy over protocol, and one broken heart had recognized another across the vast divide of species and circumstance. In a world that often seems divided by insurmountable differences, stories like Jake and Zara's remind us that love speaks a universal language. Sometimes the most profound healing comes from the most unexpected sources, and the bonds that save us are the ones we never saw coming. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of connection, survival, and the unbreakable bonds that prove love truly knows no boundaries. And the soul.